Oh, scusi.
You're not supposed to be back here.
Well, neither are you. But I'll tell you what, I won't tell anyone if you don't.
You have something I want, and you're going to give it to me.
Really? Well, I'm flattered, but I'm afraid I'm spoken for. Oh, if you'll excuse me.
I'm not in the mood for games. Give me the crucifix.
Lady, you're lucky I'm a gentleman. Because if I weren't, I would...
You'd what?
All right, fine. Just remember, I didn't want to do this.
Let's see what you've got.
Oh boy, it's finally happening. After Nathan's ever so improving as well as increasing fighting style throughout the games were put on full display throughout a variety of physical encounters, now is an excellent time to display it once again, showing just how far he'd come from his earlier days, especially when he took out crowds full of enemies. And so it's like, what's this? Serious though, it's like, what? So the ever so infamous and, let's be real here, extremely controversial Nadine fight are 2 of the 5 physical encounters you come across in this game, and they're the absolute worst by far. Not an ounce of fun, extremely pace-breaking, poorly sequenced and overly scripted fights that really put you off on the game's virtues, but also on the character of Nathan Drake himself. Oh, and yeah, I know I made a Nate vs. Nadine debunked video around a year ago, but even then, that video didn't necessarily manage to convince as much of an audience that I had been hoping to see change. So instead of just showing a compilation of moves that Nathan didn't dodge that he oh so easily should have been capable of dodging, which will also be discussed in this video, I've instead opted to full-on tackle the fights head-on, challenging it to a battle. We're talking full-on in-depth fight sense analysis here, seeing what works, what doesn't, and give a rundown on my opinion with these sequences as well as the impact it left. So we start the fight. Oh my god! So, one thing that's overly apparent is Nathan's fighting moves. For some reason, which I've been trying to wrap my head around for a while now, Nathan seems to swing with the steadiness and refinement of an 80-year-old man with a sore back. Like, seriously, look at this. He almost tumbles onto the floor trying to recover from this attack. You know, Nathan wasn't the most refined person on the planet, sure, but his reflexes made up for that lack of refinement easily. Even then, the only moment I can recall where Nathan has ever swung to the degree where he does here is during this one moment on Uncharted 3. This one moment where Nathan struggles to maintain his balance and thus leaves himself open for counterattacks, which even then, like I said, his reflexes bailed him out in good succession. But still, moments like these are completely inconsistent throughout the games and are heavily outnumbered by times where Nathan recovers from the swing by refining his attack. I can find some examples in Uncharted 3 where he doesn't go stumbling out of control, but even in the same game he doesn't stagger in place after exerting a failed attack. See this hold animation right here? Nathan throws a failed hook, but rather than staggering like he does heavily in the fights, he instead refines his attack once he realizes it's been dodged. But in the fights, ooh, oof, eesh, not really. Even moments where he does stagger, specifically in the Rape sword fight, even though he's using a sword, his reflexes bail him out, like I said. Nadine makes a note of Nathan that he is telegraphing too much. However, I don't think this is necessary, nor is it fair for him. Not only does Nadine telegraph her attacks to extents comparable to not only Nathan but also to the mercenaries he's fought, but there's also the fact that it's okay to telegraph attacks. Every fighter telegraphs, including the fighter that everyone holds in extreme regards like Chloe. The issue is speed. You need to attack quick enough so that your opponent won't be able to see it coming in time, so I find this rather unnecessary. This hold right here is seen as one of the very few actual good moments in the fight, but I disagree. I mean, sure, he lands a hit, but outside of that, he lands the hit in her blind zone out of her sight. It just doesn't feel earned knowing that you can only land hits via dog shots, and furthermore makes you feel less in control with the situation at hand, which goes completely against what we've seen thus far from Nathan. Plus, look at what he does after landing the hit. Rather than say taking steps back or quickly trying to get his bearings, he instead turns around and leaves his back completely exposed. Like, pfft, what? Okay, I think there's even more of a misunderstanding here than ever. Hell, it's not just this hold right here in fact. Throughout much of the fight, Nathan is struggling to recover from his own attacks, arguably more than Nadine's attacks, and leaves himself completely open and vulnerable for counterattacks, which goes completely against what he usually does. For instance, in Uncharted 3, pay close attention to Nathan's failed punches. Rather than continuing to exert the attack, he instead refines it in order to prepare for the incoming counterattack, dropping his arms, straightening his back and glancing into their position to furthermore prepare for the maneuver. In my eyes, Uncharted 2 is the greatest example in the series. Notice this finisher Nathan exerts on his enemies. It's an incredibly solid hook delivered straight to the enemy's face, and it serves as a counterattack as well as a finisher. Now cut to the Drazah fight and pay close attention to Nathan's initial counterattack. He bobs to the floor onto one of his knees, just like he did before, making it obvious that he's trying to land a finishing blow. However, Drazah sees this coming and blocks Nathan's punch before he lands the attack. What does Nathan do? Instead of extending his attack, he turns back to Drazah's position and pulls his arm back and reacts accordingly to Drazah's other attacks, signifying his immense adaptability, something that this doesn't facilitate well at all. I can even find examples of this in Uncharted 4, where although his reflexes were for the most part absent, he still seemed to actually care to try and respond to his opponent's counterattack. Specifically right here in the Gustavo fight, where after throwing a failed hook, rather than remaining stationary and accepting his easily avoidable fate, he instead turns to his enemy's attack and prepares to counter it, even if it does end in failure. But even then, throughout the Gustavo fights, he at least manages to land solid blow for blow and counterattacks like escaping his grappling holds rather than sitting there and doing nothing about it. Speaking of which, what happened to Nathan's reflexes? The dude used to dodge an extremely wide variety of attacks in the prior games, ranging all the way from hooks to jabs to uppercuts to push kicks, etc. Why here does he all of a sudden retain the reflexes of a slug and refuses to do crap against Nadine? I mean, sure, his reflexes were absent in Uncharted 4 for the most part, but a lot of the holds that Nathan was placed in by the mercenaries literally required Nathan to react to their attacks before they land the blow. Especially with the Rafe sword fight, where Nathan's reflexes are suddenly back, you can't exactly tell me that he lost his reflexes when moments like these exist in the fortunate shape and form that they do. Now, I've heard a lot of people try to argue that he's never dodged kicks straight to the face before, but what I ask, how does that really explain anything? Nathan's reflexes didn't hinder on the fact that he's dodged those kinds of attacks before, but rather that they hindered on the fact that he managed to avoid the attack in time, not because it was commonly seen before. For example, name one time Nathan has ever dodged a knee strike. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Did you name one? Of course you didn't. Unless you did, then good job. But for those who didn't, in Uncharted 3 he dodges a solid knee strike from this brute, in spite of it being the only time he's ever dodged a knee strike throughout the games. I mean, he also dodged Rafe's sword slashes, something we only saw him do like once in Golden Abyss, and so there's not much you can say. Even then, how did he manage to dodge all these attacks in the first place if, in spite of them being exotic, they were quote-unquote common? Also, by saying that, you're acting like as if Nadine only used kicks to pin Nathan. Also, he technically does dodge kicks directly to the face in this series, so you can't even pull that card out. In fact, outside of just his reflexes, out of nowhere his situational awareness is also flushed down the drain entirely. He never uses the environment to his advantage, which is the opposite he did in like all of the games, including Uncharted 1. And it's not like there's nothing he couldn't use, given the vases, books, statuettes, lamps, bookshelves, etc. that were present all over the room. Something that's worth noting is how Nadine attacks. Nadine seems to be more combat oriented in comparison to most of the mercenaries' singular attacks, and also, unlike a lot of the mercenaries, Nadine clearly tends to intercept and take advantage of Nathan's attacks. However, this isn't necessarily something that we've never seen before, and so I fail to see how Nathan failed so poorly in this situation. For instance, an amazing example are the Talbot fights. In the first fight, Nathan clearly struggles against Talbot's grappling and relies on tactics to pin him, but in the second fight he's seemingly in depth with handling himself against Talbot's rather advanced grappling techniques, a lot of which even require Talbot to intercept Drake's attacks. Yet Nathan still doesn't just stand there, in fact he rushes in to block or prepares to react to Talbot's attacks. Talbot isn't the only person who takes advantage of Nathan's attacks, however. There are also Zoran's men that cleverly utilize arm bars and devastating wrist locks in order to pin Nathan, but Nathan manages to break out and react accordingly to the incoming counterattacks. You can't even use the excuse that when Nathan gets hit he will lose his focus, since in the Charlie Cutter fight, Charlie will also use combos against Nathan, and even if you do get hit, you're still plenty of capable of reacting to the rest of his attacks free of any consequences. However, you can't even say that Nadine is faster given the fact that she honestly seems on par with a lot of the attacks the mercenaries exert. All because they're not combo influenced doesn't necessarily mean their singular attacks aren't quick. Especially Zoran's mercenaries, also opting to use combos and literally using the same combo starter that Nadine uses. So again, I see no reason for Nathan to fail so miserably here, when what we've seen here isn't new whatsoever. Nathan's strongest attribute to most of his previous physical encounters were his reflexes, much like any other fighter. So stripping him from one of his key attributes is a terrible idea, especially when you give his opponent the reflexes of a goddess and leave his ass to be pummeled. It's a really dumb idea, and I have no idea who thought it'd be a good or a fine idea by the slightest. That was just never going to work. Now, one of the things that's worth mentioning are some of the dialogue statements that come out of Nathan's mouth. He mentions at times how Nadine isn't helping his back, how he's jet-lagged, and just by judging by the tone of his voice, he seems rather worn out, like as if he's tired of something. This may have been one of the reasons everyone started assuming that retirement played a factor with Nathan's loss. However, I don't think that's even entirely true. Not only is he clearly wisecracking with these words, but it's also the fact that, well, it's inconsistent. Throughout the game, he's still devouring mercenaries' disasters for breakfast, with all the issues I mentioned in Nadine fights being absent these times. Especially with the Wraith sword fight, you can't exactly tell me that retirement played a key role here. Maybe a little bit, but nothing that exactly merits mention whatsoever. So then, why is Nathan like this if it isn't retirement? Is it because Nadine is a woman, as seen with this dialogue statement? Hell no. Well, ish. I mean, that does explain why Nathan would lack in terms of offense, but it still doesn't explain why Nathan is significantly lacking in terms of defense. There's nothing stopping him from at the very least trying to maybe block, intercept, or dodge her attacks to keep her at bay. Remember the Charlie Cutter fight? Canonically, you're not meant to hit Charlie in that fight. However, you're still allowed to freely dodge his moves and keep him at bay until the end of the fight. Hell, look at the beginning of the Wraith sword fight. You can attack him, but Nathan's reflexes allow him to keep Wraith at bay long enough to arm himself and fight back. And in the Uncharted comic book, Nathan and Chloe have a fight, and Nathan doesn't unleash his foolery and allow himself to get decked, so there's really no exact way you could look at it, because I don't think there's exactly anything you could say that really explains everything. There's a really popular debate out there in regards to Nathan being a crap fighter, and that claim is honestly so bad that it deserves an entire video dedicated to it. But focusing some more on dialogue exchanges and sound effects, it seems as though Nathan isn't only tired but also hurt. Some of the sound effects and body positions of Nathan facilitate this quite well, as he often hangs his hand in the place he's been hidden. The sound effects really sound brutal at times, etc. However, you think I'm going to believe that Nadine of all people hurts Nathan more than the brutes from Uncharted 3 especially did? Then you're out of your mind. Especially since Asaf from Lost Legacy managed to absolutely pummel Nadine to the ground with absolute ease, and Asaf himself not only being built smaller than the brutes, but also being built similarly to Nathan, is absolutely hilarious. I'll discuss the Asaf fight some other day, but just know that they perfectly prove what I'm trying to say right now is correct. I've heard a very popular argument out there discussing how Uncharted is bent on craziness, thus justifying Nadine's victory, but like, how does that explain her victory? It doesn't explain why Nathan's reflexes suck or anything like that. In fact, given what we've seen before from Uncharted's ridiculousness, this only explains how she's overpowering Nathan, and yes, she is overpowering him. Given how he staggers in place to a lot of her attacks, as well as him even saying this,
Son of a...
he's very clearly being overpowered. But again, Uncharted's ridiculousness being used as a means of justification in the same game that's completely absent of any ridiculous elements like Guardians or zombies, isn't very valid. Hell, it still doesn't even explain much to begin with, and even if it did, Nathan throughout all of the games was easily capable of challenging whatever ridiculous elements there were to tackle. In Uncharted 3, he literally fist-fought demons. Plus, all the supernatural elements throughout the games were linked to key historical events. Let's see, 1577 AD, Spanish conquistadors discovered the fabled treasure of El Dorado in the jungles of the Amazon, discovered it was cursed upon opening it. 1000 BC, King Solomon utilized the devastating creature of the jinn against his enemies. However, after experiencing its hallucinogenic agents for himself, he deemed the weapon inhumane and banned it. It was then sealed in a vessel of brass where it would be cast away forever in the depths of the city, until its essence leaked into the water supply and drove everyone in Ubar mad. Nadine, however... Nadine is... I'm not even too sure in all honesty. Maybe, she has a Terminator underneath her? Maybe she was injected with a super soldier formula? Honestly, I have no idea. Plus, if it is due to ridiculousness, then how could she defeat Nathan, yet not Asaf, and even take hits from his insurgents? I suppose her formula ran out of something. It reads in Nadine's bio that she's some sort of master martial artist, but not even that is facilitated well by these sequences. Nadine actually seems to fight no different than how you'd see an MMA or UFC fighter take action, and after analysing how she fights here, it's primarily karate with some boxing and judo thrown in there. Not anywhere near every major martial art, and not even half of the amount of martial arts Nathan utilizes. Also, these fights strongly act as though this is the first time Nathan has fought a martial artist, but it really isn't. Zoran's men easily utilize martial arts, spanning from their arm bars, wrist locks, and combo structures. Spanning from just that, Talbot is easily a fighter. I honestly failed to see how basically everyone decides to outright exclude Talbot's advanced grappling techniques, as well as his combat moves and stances that all match Kali knife fighting. Even Shoreline using grappling techniques similar to Zoran's men, and these are definitely not arbitrary on their part, as you cannot just cook up grappling techniques like these, especially if they work. So no, you can't even use that as an excuse. In fact, there is nothing you can actually say to defend this one. Now we come to the end of the first fight where Nathan lands yet another hit. The issue here this time is that not only is it yet another unexpected attack on Nadine's part, but Nathan also tries throwing yet another hook. Because I guess that works so goddamn well throughout the entirety of this fight. Why doesn't he throw stuff like jabs? Where are the crosses? The elbows? I mean, it's not like these wouldn't work when Asaf managed to land blows on Nadine by using these attacks, so why couldn't Nathan do it? I don't mind the arm bars she uses since we've seen it before, but besides that, everything else falls so flat. So that's the first fight down. Now we move on to the second fight. Oh my god, it's somehow worse. Plenty of the issues in the first fight play into this one, where Nathan completely abandons his usual fighting shticks of situational awareness, refinement, etc. But now we also see a number of other issues. This is the point in the fights where I realize that Nathan's fighting arsenal has really been streamlined. Nathan was a guy with an incredibly diverse number of movesets, jabs, crosses, uppercuts, hooks, side/push/roundhouse kicks, etc. In the fights, he primarily tends to use hooks or sometimes even backfists, which is pretty weird. Sure, Nathan really does like throwing punches, and in Uncharted 3 he especially loves starting combos with backfists or sucker punches, but of all things you try keeping accurate to, you don't keep accurate to his reflexes, his technique, his refinement, his arsenal, but instead you with how he starts his combos? Seriously? Even failing at that a lot of the time? It just feels arbitrarily thrown in and really contradictory to the rest of the fight, being extremely unfaithful to Nathan as a whole.
Okay, wait.
I honestly have mixed feelings with this. It is really hard to disarm Nathan, like really hard. Throughout many of the games, enemies have constantly tried disarming Nathan with brutal locks, however very rarely has Nathan ever actually failed to maintain his grip. Especially since Talbot is literally an anti-direct and arguably as strong as Nathan, I fail to see how this elbow to the nose would zone Nathan out when he's also experienced many brutal holds throughout the series. If they had just made him magically lose his pistol once he hit the floor, then that would have been more understandable. In the second fight, this time Samuel joins the fun, and in all honesty, it doesn't even feel like he's there. Nathan and Samuel, as well as the other NPCs, had amazing teamwork, delivering combos on each other, hanging by each other, etc. They didn't just say, throw around their attacks on accordingly, but were surprisingly fixed and precise with their structures. However, here though, oof, no. They barely even tend to work together. Whenever there are opportunities where you'd expect them to, instead they just waste it. For instance here, where Samuel, rather than trying to say, hit Nadine off of Nathan or trapping her attacking arm and throw her off using her strength against her, he instead tries grabbing her off? Okay. Also, why is Nathan just sitting there with his arms up as if he's surrendering? Like, seriously? Is this the same guy that discovered ancient civilizations, battled against the supernatural, took on and decimated entire armies and took on entire crowds of enemies by himself? Because it sure as hell doesn't even feel like it. After everything you've achieved, Nathan Drake, you're just going to lie there and practically yield to someone who's half or less than half the size of basically every opponent you've ever fought? Where are the shocks, the pride that you had? The same guy that achieved things humans could only dream of doing is just lying there helplessly, not even trying to defend himself? He had a perfect opportunity to land a solid hit on the back of her head, which would have most likely knocked her out, yet he instead opted to just sit there and basically see what happens next. This is not Nathan Drake. Sure, he may look and sound like him, but everything else falls flat. Hell, even literally. His determination was especially thrown out the window. He went from the same guy who was so determined to defend a father-like figure to himself, to the point where he fought off and slaughtered an entire army on his own, wandered the Rubicali Desert for 2 straight days with 0 food or water, and held off an entire band of mercenaries on his own, to the same guy who wouldn't even get off from a desk to fight for his brother, who'd been missing for 15 years, and was now in danger. Okay, sure thing. That completely contradicts the Wraith sword fight, but whatever. Hell, when Nadine pinned Samuel to the closet, that's an excellent opportunity to land a clean hit on her. Strike her down like he did to everyone else who dared strangle Samuel, but instead he slams her against the wall? But not even in the usual fashion he did where he'd throw a hook and then slam her into the wall, but he just picks up and slams her against it and then proceeds to grab her arm? Okay? Again, moments like these may be what led to everyone assuming that Nathan was holding back due to being a quote-unquote gentleman, which is understandable, but only to an extent, as stated before. Why can't he dodge or at the very least do something against her attacks when she's easily doing crap against his? As interesting as it may sound to have Nathan lose a fight, if it isn't authentic, if it feels like you had to cook up a perfectly different individual or completely strip away their capabilities in order for it to work, then I find myself being less charitable to its inclusion than anything. Outside of how much the fights fell in terms of it being an actual fight, there's also the fact that it's incredibly bad conceptually and gameplay wise. In terms of conceptually, it falls flat as it's way too scripted. Sure, the Uncharted series has had scripted sequences beforehand, but they were at least scripted yet still fun. This fight, however, it strips away all of your abilities and capabilities and thus significantly streamlines you throughout something that should just be a cutscene if anything. If you don't do crap, and if you can't do crap, then what's even the point? Gameplay wise, it's really not even a point in even touching the controller most of the time. A lot of the time you don't even need to press crap and you're more than likely to meet the same fate that still progresses you through the story, and so what's the point? You just really wanted to soak it in, didn't you? But why exactly? I mean, there have been many times where you've siphoned incredible details, it's just something there, and I'm sure the audience would have loved to see those miles more than the Nadine fights, so what's really the point? Well, that's simple. They were trying to push a pathetic feminazi agenda in this game. Neil Druckmann took heavy inspiration from Anita Sarkeesian, aka one of the biggest jokes gaming has ever seen, to produce certain events in this game, and her effects couldn't have been more clear. I'd understand why one would argue that it was perhaps just a moment played out for comedy, even though if you compare moments like this to shows like Johnny Bravo, then you'd easily see that it's baloney. But we literally have exact confirmation, there's no way around it. Employees were literally fired for opposing Druckmann's views, and his political stance was brought on full display in The Last of Us Part 2. It really isn't too hard finding this information. Now we reach the point where Nathan's kicked out of the window by Nadine, and Samuel's being strangled to death by her. Now, something we've very commonly seen from Samuel whenever you're in a fight with him is that he usually gets placed into chokeholds, and usually calls for you to bail him out. However, even if you don't bail him out, he still breaks out of it on his own. Pretty easily too, might I add. Plus, if Nathan is aware of how to do this, then why not Samuel? It's really, really stupid. Then we finish off the fight with a mega falcon punch, and this is actually a pretty cool moment. Though was it worth the frustrations that both the fights came packed with? No, not really. You can't just end in the annoying struggle with one punch, and yet again, this is delivered from Nadine's blind spot, and thus, once again, doesn't feel earned whatsoever. Sure, Nathan does have a tendency to strike in an opponent's blind spot, but holy crap, making the only moments where Nathan lands clean hits in his opponent's blind spot is bullcrap, and really, really doggish, thus leaving you with a rather lukewarm sensation in your gut towards the end of the fight and a really negatively chiseled feeling up your spine. Of course, it doesn't ruin the game, but its inclusion is easily the most unnecessary in the series by a long shot. I've seen people argue that you technically win the second fight, but it doesn't feel like it since Rafe just bails Nadine out in the end, even if you don't compare and that's only if you don't compare the ratio of getting hit compared to hitting her. So, now the question is, what's the impact these sequences left? Unfortunately, pretty negative. Many people take these fights into the most consideration and completely exclude the many other fights not only in the same game but also throughout the entire series, in spite of their greater significance. The fight sequences in Uncharted were mostly unrestricted, scripted sequences that allowed you to go all out. Even the fights that were semi-restricted like the Dante and Guerra fights were still cool as they felt like proper fights, tug-of-war-oriented physical encounters. The Nadine fights completely throw all that gloss and shine out of the window, however, instead opting to just throw you into an arena with this random Nobi character you couldn't care less about that just decks you, but not even in an authentic and or meaningful sense. It's just there for the sake of being there, and given their super restricted nature, you could have easily just siphoned these quote-unquote fights in simple cutscenes. To even call these sequences fights is honestly misleading, given the fact that when you fight someone, you at the very least try doing crap to defend yourself, which isn't even accentuated well in these encounters, where thanks to that, what we're left with are extremely controversial, safe and flawed sequences that have no real conceivable rough edges with them, no spark, and when you utterly safe and perfunctory sequences are suffering from incredibly flawed execution as well as inclusion, then that's how you end up here. What's all the more infuriating is that these issues could have easily been avoided if at least the slightest bit of care and or thought went into this idea, but instead we're just left with this completely unsatisfying feeling in our gut that can only be described as the Nadine fights from Uncharted 4 at Thief's End. So that's why, as the title implies, these fights suck, and dare I say it, are some of the worst fights in gaming history, and the worst fights in Uncharted history. If you've sat through this entire rant, then I'm sure you come to at least one solid conclusion. I sure do know my way around Uncharted. Whenever I play through the games, or at least play through the fighting sequences in an attempt to have immense fun, I sure as hell know I won't be returning to these sequences anytime soon, and honestly neither should you. Every other fight sequence throughout the game is much more worth changing a channel to. So to wrap this up guys, thanks for watching this, like really. However, I do want to apologize for being absent for about a year now. For a while I've been trying to get a new video up and running again, but I've always been held back due to some bullcrap. Like, all of my videos and photos were for some reason deleted, and so I had to start from scratch again. My PS4 really went retarded a lot of the time, and school really hasn't been doing me any favors. But anyways, you all got your video. Feel free to let me know what else Uncharted related you'd like to see on this channel, and have a Qwarktastic day.